Next on Outside the Lines First Report. Last October, tragedy struck the University of Notre Dame campus when a hydraulic lift toppled in high winds and student videographer Declan Sullivan was killed in a 40-foot fall.
It was a windy day, but a productive day. Next thing I knew, I heard that the tower was down.
Yesterday, results of an investigation into the accident found that no one person was to blame, but the university was negligent.
The most important way to memorialize Declan is to do all we can to understand the factors that led to his death and to take steps to prevent such an accident from happening at Notre Dame or anywhere else.
Outdated weather reports are now being blamed for the death of Notre Dame student Declan Sullivan. Sullivan fell from a tower while filming Notre Dame football practice last October. A Notre Dame investigation says the staff would have kept Sullivan grounded had they known winds were 29 miles per hour with gusts up to 38. The lift toppled when gusts hit 53 miles per hour. Yesterday, the university addressed the investigation. Jon Wallace, safety consultant, workplace group, who has over 2 decades of experience in the field, and Bruce Feldman, ESPN, the magazine senior writer. Now, short of shutting down the camera, John, were there any other precautions that should have been taken?
In looking at this investigation, this was foreseeable. There was a similar incident that happened at James Madison in 1995. You know, the report, I commend the report as being open, but it mentions several items that individually the University of Notre Dame said did not actually contribute or cause the incident. And what I would say is these are symptoms, but they all go to a root cause, and the root cause is that the University of Notre Dame did not have an effective scissor lift safety policy. I think this incident was foreseeable, and I think it was preventable.
Yes, I think much of what you say is true. I think in hindsight, as we look back at our procedures, we acknowledge that they weren't as strong as they could have been. We acknowledge that there were steps that we should have taken. What the report does is try to say, what can we do to be better? And so we have a number of action steps, including, changing the wind standard that we will use, assigning specific responsibility to an individual at all times on every practice field, not just our football practice fields, but for every sport. And so I think you raise an issue that is a very valid issue, and that is that our protocols and our procedures at the time of the accident were not all that they should have been.
Bruce, I want to get to you in a moment because I want to discuss with you the responsibility of the football program. But John Sullivan, again, to ask the question, should there be one person at least in charge whose only job is safety, Jon Wallace rather, safety on the field in any aspect, whether it's the scissor cranes or players who are running wind sprints, but their only job is that the field is safe?
I like to have somebody who has overall safety responsibility, but just as importantly or more importantly, I want everybody in the scissor lift to be trained when they go up in the scissor lift, if they think the conditions are unsafe, to bring that to their supervisor's attention. If they're up in the scissor lift and they're concerned, that they have the ability to bring the scissor lift down, and then also if somebody on the ground identifies a concern, that they can have the scissor lift brought down as well. So we don't want just one person having responsibility. We want to have scissor lift operators that have hazard recognition, and they can identify hazards and have safety measures in place. So,
okay.
So we're not dependent upon one person and, not able to think and act on our own.
Bruce, this is tragedy in any instance, but the fact that it happened at a football field when we're just playing a game makes it that much more tragic, it seems. Brian Kelly, a lot of people feel that it was the coach's responsibility. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, ultimately, with anything that goes on with a program, it's ultimately on the head coach. And I think the people who report to him, the support staff, whether it's his director of football operations or his video guy, I mean, these guys all funnel into Brian Kelly. And those guys are out at practice. I mean, a lot of them are just standing around observing what is going on. I mean, let's keep in mind that the National Weather Service had issued a wind advisory till 9 o'clock that day. And I also thought from the report that one thing that jumped out at me, the first thing I saw, was that they had determined that they couldn't conclusively determine if Declan Sullivan himself felt unsafe. And the first thing I thought of when I read that was, well, we have those tweets that he had posted that sounded like he really felt unsafe. The fact that he had checked the weather service right before he went up there, but also, saying it less than an hour before the tragedy happened. I think that thing kind of jumped out at me as being very, very curious.
Well, Bruce, again, okay, go ahead.
John, can I just respond to a couple of those? Because I think that both John and Bruce brought up very valid points. And the one is that training is essential. And I think it alludes to both of the points that they raised up, is that we checked very carefully with all of our current videographers, and we went back to 1998 to speak to other videographers to make sure that they all knew that they had the authority to do whatever it took to protect themselves, including to lower the lift. So I absolutely agree with John that you don't want one person only to have safety responsibility and then everybody else can relax and not do anything. Training remains an essential part of that. And one of our recommendations going forward is to substantially improve our training program, to require formal recognition of that program before anybody can go up in a lift. So I absolutely agree with the point that he was making.
Well, Jon Wallace, let me ask you this. Notre Dame has now changed the way they're going to actually film their practices. They will no longer use scissor lifts. They are going to have fixed places for the cameras to be set, and they will be remotely controlled. Would you recommend this to all schools?
I would always recommend, in trying to eliminate the hazard before we have to have scissor lifts and other protective devices. And one thing that I want to comment is, after the first incident when I appeared on ESPN, I had several people call me, student athletes as well as parents, and I want to emphasize that it's just not the scissor lift that's a hazard with videographers and student athletes. I've had stories of people working 2 or 3 feet from the edge of a roof, 5 stories high, doing video work or being on a scoreboard. So I want to make sure this conversation is not limited to just a scissor lift, that we look at all types of fall issues with videographers and student athletes. So
and
yes,
Bruce,
let's eliminate the hazard.
Go ahead.
So let's try to eliminate the hazard before we have to put somebody in a scissor lift.
So, Bruce, what I wanted to ask you was, have you heard now, as a result of this tragedy, are there changes that other schools are making around the country, or precautions now that they're putting into place? Because 99% of most schools don't have any types of precautions.
No, they don't. And John, the other thing to keep in mind is Notre Dame, is at the top of the food chain when it comes to finances and support. A lot of other programs, I mean, they're cutting corners on things. The one thing that we all hope comes from this is that something like this never happens again, and that there's an awareness to it. But in terms of whether somebody's putting in towers that are a lot more structurally sound for this, or there are still schools using these lifts, and I think the issue is going to come up. It's whether it's 20 mile per hour winds or 30 mile per hour winds. I think it's only going to be a matter of time before people kind of they forget, because it didn't happen to them. I don't think it's ever going to happen at Notre Dame, thankfully, but I think there's going to be other schools that probably their awareness, it doesn't hit close enough home to them, honestly.
And John, if I can just add to that, that is such an important point that was made there, is that, and I think we tried to say this, is that the use of these aerial lift platforms per se is not a problem, as long as they're used responsibly and safely. And, one of the ways that we are hoping to memorialize Declan's life is to work with others on a national education program that doesn't just say, yeah, you have to spend a lot of money and put in fixed equipment, that there's a safe way to use these. We have to have better safety protocols, and that has to go not just to colleges, as I think it was Bruce made the point. This goes to high schools, it goes to bands, it goes to people operating all sorts of other things across the country. And, that's one way we really look forward to working with others, with IOSHA, with the NCAA, and in particular, with the Sullivan family, who to their enormous credit, out of this terrible tragedy that has happened to them, one of their major focuses have been, let's educate others. And Notre Dame wants to be a part of that, will be a part of that, and encourages everybody else who can to join us in this effort.
Absolutely, and all of this in the memory, of course, of Declan Sullivan. I want to thank all of our guests for being here with us today.